I was standing at the register when my daughter-in-law slid between me and the clerk and said, "This old woman is the maid. Don't talk to her." And my son laughed like it was the funniest thing he'd heard all week. The boy at the till couldn't meet my eyes after that. A stranger's pity burned worse than family cruelty, but here is the part they didn't know as their laughter tangled in the air, like plastic bags in a storm. I owned a share of the store they were using to humiliate me, and before the day was over, I would cancel every inheritance they were counting on. It began that morning at 10 a.m., when Meadow insisted she come along for groceries, a rare show of enthusiasm dressed in perfume and a designer purse. "Come on, Grandma Bessie," my grandson Judd called from the back seat of Blaine's SUV. "We're getting ice cream after," and that sweet scrap of inclusion fluttered through me like a bird that had forgotten the way out. I climbed in slowly, arthritis, turning every movement into a negotiation, and Meadow glanced back with a smile that felt like a blade as she murmured, "Try not to embarrass us in there." I didn't answer. I had learned that responding only gave her more room to perform. Blaine tapped the wheel, humming the picture of a man who believed good intentions could be stapled over bad behavior. We drove in domestic silence toward Morrison's Market, a place I'd walked for 3 decades, a place where cashiers once knew my apple pie days and my pot roast nights. The store was busy for a Tuesday, families debating cereal, an elderly couple reading labels like love letters, a nurse grabbing salads for a late shift. Meadow steered our cart as if commanding a parade, and Judd trotted beside her, trying to be chosen. "Stay on the list," Meadow said, without looking at me when I paused at the baking aisle, and I tucked my small longing back where it belonged. At the register, a young man with kind eyes greeted us. "Good morning, ma'am." "How are you today?" he said, and I opened my mouth to answer. Meadow sliced in before my voice could stand. "This old woman is the maid. Don't talk to her." Blaine burst into a full, delighted laugh, and Judd followed, chirping, "Yeah, Grandma's like our servant rehearsing a joke he didn't know was a bruise." My hand tightened around the strap of my old purse until my knuckles went pale, and the cashier, now all stiff apology, moved his gaze to Meadow. "Paper or plastic?" he asked her as if I'd flickered out of existence. Plastic. Meadow purred satisfied. Behind us, the line watched the performance like bad theater you cannot walk out of. In the car, they dissected weekend plans, Meadow's spa day, Blaine's golf, and no one remembered ice cream. Back home, I put groceries away on autopilot while they drifted to screens and rooms, and the house felt like a polite hotel where I worked for tips no one left. When the kitchen was neat enough to erase me, I went to my small bedroom, the one I'd agreed to take when Meadow moved in 5 years earlier, because she said, "We need the master." It just makes sense. My reflection in the little mirror had shrunk without my permission. Gray hair pinned in the same practical bun, clean clothes worn thin by service. Once I'd run a small catering business from this very stove. Neighbors booked me months ahead for pot roasts and pies, and money from those dinners stitched a safety net under our lives. Meadow had called it embarrassing and unsafe, and one by one she found reasons to end it, too messy, too noisy, too disruptive, until my clients vanished, and so did the sound of my name said with respect. Night fell, and I sat on the edge of the narrow bed, still in grocery store clothes, replaying the moment at the register until the words lost grammar and became knives. It wasn't the cruelty that rooted deepest. It was Blaine's laughter, the sound my baby boy once made when I held him to the window to watch summer storms. I looked around the room I'd let myself fit into like a borrowed coat, and a small, steady voice cleared its throat in my chest. "Who are you without their smallness?" I stood cross to the closet, pushed old coats aside, and reached toward the back, where a little safe waited with a combination only my hands still knew. The numbers turned beneath my fingers like a wheel returning to true, and for the first time in years, I felt the click of my own life opening. The door of the safe swung open like a breath I hadn't let myself take in years, and inside were the paper bones of a woman I had once been proud to be bank statements, clipped with tidy dates, investment summaries that had grown from small, stubborn seeds, property deeds, whose corners had softened with time and touching. I spread them across the quilt, my hand steadying, as the truth arranged itself in columns 3 rental buildings downtown, with leases that never missed a month, a well-diversified portfolio I'd built one careful choice at a time, and the crown I'd kept hidden even from myself. 40% of Morrison's market acquired when Bill Morrison needed capital and I had faith. I whispered into the quiet. You were never the maid, and the room seemed to expand around me like a lung, relearning how to fill. By 6 a.m., dawn pressed its thin light against the curtains, and I packed the documents back into the safe, not with fear, but with the sure rhythm of a plan. I slept a few hours, woke to the sound of the coffee maker in the kitchen, and moved through the day as if walking beneath a lake, everything muffled, everything clear. 3 days slipped by, the wound scabbing into resolve, and then one afternoon at 3 p.m., I came home from a short walk to the front door, slightly ajar, and Meadow's laughter rolling through the house like glass beads on tile. I was turning toward the stairs when I heard my name glide through the living room, coated in honey and vinegar. Honestly, I don't know how much longer I can stand having her here, Meadow said, with the practiced exasperation of a woman performing empathy. She shuffles like a ghost. Can't Blaine just put her in a home? A friend's voice, Sandra answered. How much longer can it be really? She's 70 and she looks older. Meadow's reply came with a theatrical sigh. We're waiting for the inheritance situation to resolve. Blaine thinks there's a little money somewhere. It would be stupid to move her before we know what we're dealing with. I pressed my back to the wall as if the plaster could hold me up my heart, knocking a dull code I finally understood. They weren't planning a future. They were counting down to mine. That night, I plated dinner the way I always did, and Meadow poked the chicken with the bored judgment of a food critic between marriages. A little dry, she said, not looking at me. Blaine didn't look up from his phone when he added, We'll need you to pack your room for painting next week. I answered. Of course, because I had learned that surrender is the most beautiful disguise for strategy. After the dishes, I sat alone at 9 p.m. with the kitchen light, painting a hard circle on the table, and dialed a number I hadn't used in a long time. Bill answered on the second ring, his voice tired but kind, and when I said, I'm ready to be more than a silent partner, he paused and then breathed, Bessie, I've been hoping you'd say that. The next morning at 8:30 a.m., the market felt different under my feet, not a stage but a room with my name on a chair. Bill's office smelled like coffee and paper, his desk a familiar clutter. What sort of active role, he asked, and I told him I wanted to begin with customer service training with a refresher on dignity that could travel from aisle to aisle the way announcements did. And I'd like a small office, nothing grand, somewhere I can be present. He nodded, rolling a pen between his fingers as if winding a key, and we walked through inventory numbers, margins, a succession plan he'd been sketching toward retirement. At 10:15 a.m., he handed me a name, Sarah Mitchell. He said estate planning. Discreet, thorough. The pen clicked shut with the sound of a door locking behind me, and I understood I had stepped into a hallway with only one direction forward. By 11 a.m., Sarah's office smelled faintly of citrus and law books, and she listened without blinking as I unfolded the quiet years. When she finally spoke, her voice did not pity me, it dignified me. What you are describing, she said, is financial and emotional abuse. You are allowed to change your mind about your legacy. I told her I wanted Blaine removed, Judd, protected by a trust he would earn with respect rather than expectation, and most of the rest given to people who would never laugh at a woman in a checkout line. She wrote quickly, then looked up. We'll proceed immediately, she promised, and my pulse slowed into a steady drumbeat. Outside noon, heat lifted off the sidewalks, and I walked home with my head high, already rehearsing the first honest sentence I would speak to Meadow in years. The storm was building in the distance, and for once I was not the thing to be weathered, I was the weather coming. When I opened the front door that afternoon, the air inside felt different, heavier, like the house could sense the shift it wasn't ready for. Meadow was in the kitchen blending her morning smoothie even though it was nearly 1 p.m. She looked up, irritation already waiting in her eyes. Where were you? I needed you to watch Judd this morning. I wiped my hands on my cardigan and said simply, I had some errands. Business matters. She frowned. What kind of business? You don't have any business. I set my purse down and began chopping vegetables for lunch, the rhythm calm and precise. Personal affairs. I replied, not looking at her. She blinked, confused, unused to hearing me assert the boundaries of my own life. Next time you should tell someone where you're going, she said after a beat, her voice sharper than the knife in my hand. We worry when you disappear. I smiled faintly at the lie and said, I'll keep that in mind. And for the first time, she stepped back. 2 weeks later, everything was ready. The paperwork signed, the accounts shifted, the will rewritten. I moved through the house with quiet composure, cooking, cleaning, existing as though nothing had changed, even as the ground beneath their feet began to split. Every cruel remark they tossed my way landed on a heart too busy rebuilding itself to feel the sting. By the time the morning of reckoning arrived, I had already made peace with the woman I used to be. That day, I woke before sunrise, brewed my coffee and watched the mist lift from the garden like an omen. At exactly 10 a.m., a knock echoed through the hallway. Meadow looked up from her magazine, annoyed. Are you expecting someone? She asked. Yes, I said, smoothing the front of my blouse. I am. When I opened the door, Sarah Mitchell stood there in a navy suit briefcase in hand with a younger man beside her carrying another. Good morning, Mrs. Harrison, she said warmly. I have the documents we discussed. Meadow appeared behind me almost instantly, curiosity tripping her faster than her heels. Who is this? She demanded. This is my attorney, I answered. She's here to deliver some personal business paperwork. Meadow's painted smile twitched. Personal business, she repeated like the words themselves were foreign. Sarah handed me a thick envelope, the weight of months and decades inside it. Everything is finalized, she said, and this is James Morrison, Bill Morrison's son. He's here regarding your business transfer. Meadow's voice hitched. Business transfer. What business transfer? I turned to her slowly. Perhaps we should all sit down. Blaine emerged from the kitchen, confused. Mom, what's going on? He asked, and they both followed me to the living room, their curiosity curdling into unease. I stayed standing while they took the couch. 3 weeks ago, I began quietly, you called me the maid in front of strangers. Meadow's face paled, her lips parting to protest, but I held up a hand. You laughed, Blaine. You both did. You humiliated me in a store I helped build, and I said nothing because silence was easier than being told I was overreacting. But I've learned that silence only teaches people how to treat you worse. Blaine's voice cracked. Mom, please. It was a joke. Was it also a joke? I interrupted when you discussed putting me in a home, when you talked about waiting for my inheritance to resolve itself. The blood drained from Meadow's face, her posture stiff as glass. You were eavesdropping in our home, she said finally. Yes, I replied, and I thank God I did. I opened the envelope and pulled out the first document. These are the changes to my will. Blaine, you've been removed entirely. Judd will receive a trust fund when he turns 25 if he earns it through respect and kindness, not obligation. Everything else will go to charity. Blaine's hands clenched on his knees. Mom, you can't do this. We're family. I met his eyes. Family doesn't treat each other the way you've treated me. Sarah nodded at James, who stepped forward and opened his briefcase. Mrs. Harrison, he said formally, as of yesterday, your ownership in Morrison's Market has increased to 40%, and you have taken an active managerial role. You also own controlling interests in 3 additional grocery stores and 12 commercial properties. The silence that followed was a living thing. What Meadow whispered, her voice trembling. That's impossible. She doesn't have any money. Sarah glanced at her notes. Conservatively, Mrs. Harrison's total assets amount to roughly $47 million. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Blaine looked at me as though the air had betrayed him. Why didn't you tell us? He asked. Because I said softly you would have treated me differently, and that is precisely why I didn't. The room crackled with the sound of their disbelief, and for the first time I saw myself not as their burden, but as their mirror, reflecting everything they refused to see. Blaine stood suddenly pacing toward the window, like a trapped man looking for an exit that wasn't there. "We would have helped you manage it," he said finally, desperation leaking through the cracks in his voice. I looked at him, really looked, and saw not the son I'd raised, but the man Meadow had sculpted, polished, entitled hollowed out by comfort. "You mean," I said quietly, "you would have managed me." Meadow's painted smile was gone, replaced by a trembling mask that no longer fit her face. "This can't be legal," she stammered, turning to Sarah as if the law might rescue her. "You can't just take away our home." Sarah's tone was calm, professional, but final. "Mrs. Harrison hasn't taken anything. She purchased the property from you, Mr. Harrison. The deed was transferred yesterday morning." Blaine froze mid-step. What Sarah handed him a folder. "The mortgage was reassigned to her holding company. You have 30 days to vacate the premises." The silence was a storm collapsing in on itself. Meadow gripped the arm of the couch, her voice a whisper. "You can't do this. This is our home, Judd's home." I straightened, every vertebrae unfolding like a prayer. It was my home first. I lived here for 22 years before either of you set foot through the door. For 5 years, you've made me feel like an unwanted guest. Now it's time you learn what that feels like. Meadow shook her head slowly, her perfect hair trembling loose. "You're ruining our lives." I held her gaze. "No, I'm freeing mine." I gathered the documents back into their envelope, my heartbeat steady, unhurried. "The attorneys will handle everything I said. I'll be at the downtown hotel until further notice." Blaine's voice broke as I reached the stairs. "Mom, please. We can fix this. We can change." I paused, one hand on the banister, and turned slightly toward him. "I'm 70 years old, Blaine. I don't have time left to wait for you to learn how to love me properly." His mouth opened, but no words came out. Only the sound of Meadow's quiet sobs filled the room as I climbed the stairs, each step shedding a piece of the woman they'd built for their convenience. I packed lightly, just clothes, jewelry, the safe, and when I closed the door behind me, it felt like the house exhaled for the first time in years. 6 months later, the air smelled of lake water and lemons. I sat on the terrace of my villa overlooking Lake Como, a cup of espresso warm in my hands, sunlight gilding the mountains in pink and gold. Freedom had a texture here. Soft linens, clean air, unhurried mornings. Elena, my housekeeper, placed a vase of fresh roses on the table and smiled. "Call from America, Signora," she said, holding out the cordless phone. "A young man named Judd." My heart warmed before I even heard his voice. "Grandma," he said softly, older, somehow more aware. "How are you?" "I'm wonderful," I said, meaning it. "How are things at home?" There was a pause filled with distance. "Different," he said. "Mom and Dad are getting divorced. Mom moved out last month." I closed my eyes briefly, unsurprised. Without the illusion of inheritance binding them, their marriage had always been a house built on sand. "Are you okay?" I asked gently. "Yeah," he said. "I think so. Dad's been asking about you. He wants to call. But I think he's only sorry because of the money. His honesty broke something tender open in me." "And you, sweetheart," I asked, "what are you sorry for?" His voice went quiet. "For laughing at you that day in the store. I knew it was wrong, but I wanted them to think I was funny." My throat tightened. "Thank you for saying that. It means more than you know." "Can I come visit you someday?" he asked, hopeful. "Not because of the money, just because I miss you." I smiled, watching a small boat cut across the glassy water. "When you're old enough to travel on your own, and if you come for the right reasons, my door will always be open." After we hung up, I sat for a long while listening to the bird song and the hum of distant bells. Judd was the future, the proof that kindness could survive even in poisoned soil. Blaine had tried calling too, leaving messages through lawyers and through Judd, but I had nothing left to give him but silence. Some lessons are learned only when there's no audience to applaud your remorse. Later that afternoon, Elena brought me the day's mail. Among the envelopes was one with Meadows' looping handwriting. I almost threw it away, but curiosity won. The letter was 3 pages of threats, braided with pleas. She needed money for her divorce. She'd change. She'd do anything if I'd reconsider. I read it once, folded it neatly, and carried it to the fireplace. The flames caught fast, curling her words into smoke and silence. Some bridges are meant to burn so you can see the sky. That evening, I walked to the village market, greeting vendors by name. They didn't know or care about my past or my wealth. They liked my laugh, my stories, the way I asked about their families. I bought bread from Giuseppe Flowers from Marta and walked home through streets painted in sunset. In this small town, I wasn't someone's servant or someone's investment. I was simply Bessie, a woman finally at peace with the sound of her own name. At dusk, I called my financial advisor in New York. We spoke of foundations, one for elderly people enduring family neglect, another for single mothers starting small businesses, and a scholarship fund for anyone brave enough to begin again after losing everything. My money, finally, had a soul. When the sky deepened to violet, I lifted my glass of wine toward the lake, whispering to second chances, to self-respect, to the radical act of choosing yourself. I thought of that day in Morrison's Market of the laughter that had once reduced me to a ghost and realized it had been the beginning, not the end. Because sometimes the only way to reclaim your worth is to let the world mistake you for invisible until the day you decide to shine. If my story touched you, leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from and what you would have done in my place. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe because every woman who's ever been made to feel small deserves to hear that it's never too late to start over.